I'm Dr. Murphy Westwood. I am the tree conservation specialist here at the Morton Arboretum. And today I'm going to tell you about our global tree conservation program, which is a relatively new initiative. So the Morton Arboretum has long been a leader in the science and practice of urban tree care and in studying the ecology and conservation of Midwest ecosystems. So we've had a very strong regional and local focus, but in the last few years, we've become increasingly concerned about the world's tree biodiversity and the fact that it is disappearing. So we have decided to do something about that with our global tree conservation program. What I'm going to do today is give you a world tour of threatened trees. I'm going to be highlighting a few of the sort of important and interesting threatened trees around the world and use them to illustrate the various initiatives and programs of the Global Tree Conservation Program. So to start with, just to get us all on the same page, I'm going to go through some sort of definitions and explain some concepts. So first of all, what is a threatened species? You are probably already all aware of this, but generally we use the term more endangered species. Has everybody heard endangered species? Yeah. So what are some of the things that we think about when we hear the term endangered species? The giant panda, classic, right? Everyone's heard about the giant panda, in trouble with its populations in China. The blue whale. Blue whales are endangered. Sea turtles, we hear about that a lot too. And Christmas trees. What? Christmas trees? Yes. I know, you're thinking that's crazy. But let's first of all talk about how you define something as being endangered or threatened. And then I'll explain why, yes, our Christmas trees are in fact threatened. So how do we decide if a species is endangered? Who makes that decision? As Megan said, there's a program called the Red List. The Red List is the world's most widely accepted global framework and authority for determining the threat level of plant and animal species. The Red List is administered by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is a big global nonprofit organization whose mission is to influence, encourage, and assist societies throughout the world to conserve nature and to ensure that any use of natural resources is equitable and ecologically sustainable. So the IUCN creates and manages the Red List, which is this big database of threat assessments for plant and animal species. And the Red List basically takes all of the species in the world and puts them into one of these 9 threat categories. They range from, in green here, least concern, so not threatened, they're fine, we're not too worried about them, all the way up to extinct, which is obviously bad, right? That ship has sailed, we missed the opportunity, that species is gone forever. And then there's a sort of range of other categories in between. There's also 2 categories at the end here, not evaluated and data deficient. Not evaluated means that the species has never even been considered to evaluate for a threat assessment. It could even mean that we don't even know that that species exists yet. We haven't discovered it or described it. So actually, a lot of species are in the not evaluated category. Data deficient means that we actually did evaluate that species, but we just didn't have quite enough information to decide with certainty which one of these categories it belongs in. So what sort of information do we need in order to apply the Red List categories? Well, we think about demographics, stuff like population size. Is the population increasing? Is it decreasing? Is it fluctuating wildly? Because that's kind of risky. We also think about population fragmentation. So are all of the individuals in that species together and able to reproduce? Or are they isolated from each other so that they're not sharing genes? We also think about the geographic range. So is a species spread over 1,000 miles and has a lot of different sort of variable habitats that it lives in? Or is it in an incredibly isolated spot, like let's say the top of a mountain somewhere? So these are all factors that determine whether or not a species is at risk for extinction. Other considerations we take into account are habitat quality. Is that getting better or getting worse? The threats, for example, is it really susceptible to climate change? Or is there an invasive species that's competing with it? Or is there a new pest or pathogen that's ravaging those populations? And then we think about the level of exploitation, so the sort of human side of things. Are we harvesting the species for, let's say, timber or for food or for medicine? Because that obviously is going to impact whether or not the species survives. So once we gather this information, we can sort of apply these categories. And for the purpose of this talk, what we're really interested in are the threatened categories. So vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered. So going back to what we were talking about earlier with endangered species, that's where this term came from. And it's just one of the 3 threatened categories. So I use threatened rather than endangered because I'm thinking of the sort of bigger picture of threatened species. Another category worth mentioning is the near threatened category. That means that a species, we've considered these various demographic pieces of information, and a species is very close to the threshold that we set before you get into the vulnerable category. So it might be, if let's say 10,000 individuals makes you vulnerable, maybe that species has 11,000 individuals. So it's getting close, right? It's decreasing, but it's just not quite there yet. We want to flag that to make sure that we're aware that something's kind of teetering on the edge. Another category, the data deficient one, is also, we red flag that a little bit, because if something is data deficient, like as a culture of like botanists and biologists, we have a pretty good grasp of the biodiversity in the world. And if we can't get enough information to categorize a species in one of these threat categories, it means it's probably got a really restricted population in a very isolated spot somewhere, which also does not bode well for its survival in the long term, because there probably aren't very many of them left if we don't know anything about them. So that's a little bit of background on the red list. So if we go back to the panda, right? The panda has been evaluated, and it has been determined to be endangered. And this is actually what the IUCN sort of user interface, what the database looks like when you access it online. And I encourage everybody to go and play around with this and have a look and search for some of your favorite species and see if they've been evaluated. It's just iucnredlist.org, and all this information is available. So the panda has been evaluated, and it was found to be endangered. And there's a justification here for why it was endangered. Less than 2,500 mature individuals. So that's population size. Very few individuals left. We also know that each population is believed to have fewer than 250 mature individuals. The fact that these populations are isolated and there's only 250 individuals, it means that they're not reproducing with each other. Otherwise, that number would be bigger. So a lot of population fragmentation. There's also general population decline that's predominantly due to habitat loss. So these are the factors that went into play to determine that this was an endangered species. So let's have a look at our Christmas tree. This is a Fraser fir. I'm sure many of you have had them in your living room about this time of year in the past. The Fraser fir, Abies fraseri, is categorized as also endangered, so the same as the panda. And the reason for this is that in the last several years, there's been a rapid decline in the populations because of an alien pathogen, an insect, which is this balsam woolly adelgid that's been ravaging the wild populations of this species in Appalachia. Because it's been decreasing the population size, the range for this species is now well under 500 kilometers squared, which is pretty small for a plant. And the population is in continuing decline because this insect we don't have a way to stop it in the wild. So for that reason, the Fraser fir, the wild populations, let me clarify that, the trees that come to you for Christmas are farmed. They usually have their own seed orchards on these farms, and they are a very, very, very narrow representation of the genetic diversity of that species. So the red list does not take into account any cultivated or farmed individuals. So that's why it sounds crazy when you say that it's endangered. We see millions of them every year. It's the wild populations, and that's really what's valuable in terms of genetic diversity and success for the species in the long term. So going back to our original examples, these are the sort of quantified threat levels for the species that I mentioned before. And the thing that I just really want to get across is that are, they're species of trees that are as endangered as the, the giant panda and the blue whale. And I think, a lot of people maybe don't realize that. So now that we know how to determine whether or not something is threatened, which tree species are threatened and where are they? And before I get into that, we're going to have another definition, and that is, what's a tree? I know what you're thinking. This lady works in an arboretum and she doesn't know what a tree is. You're right. It's kind of nuts. But in fact, defining a tree is harder than it seems. We don't really have a botanical there's no technical botanical way to define a tree. There are no hard and fast rules. It's sort of like the concept of a vegetable, right? Eat your vegetables. Botanically, there's no such thing as a vegetable. It can be a stem or a leaf or or even a fruit, right? Like tomatoes and eggplants. Those are actually fruits, but we call them vegetables. So vegetable and tree are sort of human conventions. And it's kind of hard to define what a tree is. But we all have a pretty good concept, right? We have a mental image of a tree. So like a deciduous hardwood, maples, ash, oaks, trees, right? Yeah, okay, we all agree, trees. Conifers? Trees, yeah, I'm convinced. What about like a woody shrub, right? In some growing conditions, these can grow on a single stem and be pretty tall and kind of tree-like, so maybe? What about these crazy things? Palm trees, for example, they really do look like trees, but palms don't actually produce wood. Not in the true botanical sense of wood, which is secondary xylem. I'm not going to use any more crazy jargon than that. But we think of palms as definitely being trees, but botanically, they're kind of shaky on what some people would call a defining factor of a tree, which is wood production. Cycads. Cycads we don't normally think of as trees, but actually a few of those species do produce secondary xylem, so wood. And then there's this crazy stuff, tree ferns, cacti that have evolved to look really a lot like a tree, and this aloe plant, which is also very tree-like. So it gets a little bit hairy when you're trying to define and identify how many tree species are really threatened. But for the purposes of conservation, we're going to take a pretty flexible general approach for what a tree is, and we're going to say that it's a large woody plant, so we'll include palms in that. It's perennial, it's long-lived, and it's slow to reproduce. The conservation nonprofit organization, Botanic Gardens Conservation International, defines a tree as a woody plant growing on a single stem, usually to a height of over 2 to 3 meters. So even that's a little waffly, but so this is like one of the challenges, right? Just defining a tree in the first place. But let's go with this definition. How many tree species are there? Well, let's look at the family tree of trees. And I'm going to use one more jargon word, and that is phylogeny. Phylogeny is basically just a family tree. It tells you that, so for this phylogeny, which is of all the land plants, so everything above algae, it tells you basically how they're all related to each other, when they shared a last common ancestor, and sort of roughly the structure of where they all fit in. And we think that there are about 400,000 species of land plants. But that's another take-home point from this talk, is that we don't really know how many plant species there are. We discover loads of them every year, and we're naming them every year. So we've still got a lot of work to do, but we have a sort of general idea for how many we think there are. And that's about 400,000 species of land plant. Now, if I overlay trees, or like a tree-like form, onto these groups, you see that there are trees all across the land plant phylogeny. There are a lot of trees, actually. In fact, we think about 1 in 4 species as a tree, which would make about 100,000 tree species. So now that we know how many trees there are, we know how to define a tree, and we know how to determine whether something is threatened, we can say with some degree of confidence that at least 10% of the world's tree species are threatened with extinction. The 2014 Red List was just published, and it included 15,000 tree species. Of those, almost 10,000 were found to be in one of those threatened categories. So this graph here basically displays all of the 15,000 trees that were evaluated up until now for the Red List. and which ones of them are threatened. And in this graph, the extinct and then the critically endangered are over here, and it moves towards sort of less threat level. So the kind of shocking thing about this is that 2/3 of the trees that we have assessed so far are threatened. So even though we don't know the number for all 100,000 tree species, this is not looking good. Also, there are 1,100 species that are critically endangered, meaning that we are seriously worried about them. They're on the verge of extinction. And in fact, if you look at this bar graph and you take into account the near threatened category and then the data deficient, which again are some of those red flag categories, it's actually only about 15% of tree species that we would say are solidly in the safe zone. So, you know, this is kind of worrying. So, should we care? Well, yes, certain groups are highly threatened. And they're actually the plant groups that are really highly threatened. So this graph is it basically displays the proportion of living species in these categories of plants and animals for which we're pretty sure that we know all of the species that there are in those different groups. So this graph basically doesn't have any of the not evaluated species. And it tells you which proportion are in the threatened zones, which are the red, orange, yellow colors, and which ones are least concern. So for lobsters, for example, we know that there are 248 species of lobster, and only like 2 are threatened. So good news if you're a lobster. Plants, on the other hand, and I just want to point out that this is kind of a pretty common trend, animals get a lot more attention than plants. These are the only 3 plant groups that have been comprehensively investigated. And sadly, they're down at the bottom, which is where the more sort of higher threat levels are. For conifers, for example, of the 605 species of conifer, which is probably pretty accurate, we'll probably discover a few more, but that's pretty close to the number of conifers that are out there. 1/3 of them are threatened with extinction. For cycads, the picture is even worse. There are 2/3 of the species are in these threatened categories. And if you include the near threatened and the data deficient categories, it brings it up to 85% that we're concerned about. So we know that plants are in trouble. Where do these species live, right? Where do those threatened plants where are they distributed? This is a map of the parts of the world with the highest concentration of threatened species. If you can't see these numbers, this section correlates to the global map, and this correlates to the North American detailed map. And that red zone there is between 1,000 and 1,840 endangered plant species. These are plants, not just trees, but you get the picture. And what you see is that there are definitely areas in the world where there's a high concentration of endangered species. Places like Hawaii, Southern California, Ecuador, West Africa, and Madagascar, and Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean. But how does this compare to levels of biodiversity just sort of overall? So this is where the endangered plants are. Where is the richest biodiversity in the world? And you'll not be surprised to see that they pretty much overlap completely. This is a map of our global biodiversity hotspots. And a hotspot, biodiversity hotspot, is basically a region on Earth where you have a very high concentration of plant and animal species, but you also have a lot of habitat destruction, over 70% habitat destruction. So a lot of pressure from humans through development and deforestation. And what you see is that a lot of the same places are flagged. So Southern California, Hawaii, the Caribbean, Ecuador, West Africa, Madagascar, Southeast Asia. So the point is that the places on Earth that have the most biodiversity are also under the most pressure from humans. They're losing their most habitat, and they have the highest number of threatened species. Well, why should we worry about this? What good are trees? Well, I probably don't have to convince you too much because you're here, you're in an arboretum, that's great. You clearly already care. But let's just go through the exercise. Why should we conserve trees? Well, they're the backbone of forest ecosystems. They support over half of Earth's terrestrial biodiversity by providing homes and food for animals and insects. They clean the air and they sequester carbon. And we think that these ecosystem services that they provide are valued at somewhere near $5 trillion a year. They provide timber and fuel and fiber and food and medicine. They prevent flooding and soil erosion, and they maintain our fresh water yield and quality. And they also carry significant cultural and religious meaning. This is a wonderful painting of the Buddha attaining enlightenment underneath a Bodhi fig tree. And our Latin name for this species is Ficus religiosa. So I think that just goes to show that like plants and trees and botany and humans have been intertwined for really a long time. We have a lot of skin in this game, and I think it's worth worrying about our trees. So we know trees are important, and we know they're in trouble. What are we doing about it? Well, enter the Morton Arboretum's Global Tree Conservation Program. Our mission is to save trees from extinction through global collaborations. To do that, we want to build capacity in botanic gardens and arboreta around the world to protect trees. We want to foster collaborations between botanic gardens and arboreta so that we work more efficiently and effectively together. And we want to catalyze action generally for tree conservation. Our program is global in scope, but we do have several key regional and institutional targets and areas where we invest a lot of energy. And so what I'm going to do now is take you on a world tour of some interesting and important threatened trees and use them to illustrate these key target areas that we are focusing on. So I'm going to start my tour in Australia. And I would like to introduce you to the Wollemi pine. This is Wollemia nobilis, and it was first described only from fossils. We actually thought that this species went extinct about 5 million years ago. And then, in 1994, a park ranger was hiking in a national park about an hour outside of Sydney, Australia, a hugely populous area, and discovered, when he climbed over a ridge, that there was a valley with a small population of these trees growing there. So much to our surprise, this thing has leapt back to life after 5 million years of extinction. Okay. So we call it a living fossil because we thought it was extinct, but also, once we discovered these things in real life, it turns out that they haven't really changed much in 200 million years. If you compare what this tree looks like today to fossils of the same family or the same species from 200 million years ago, they're almost identical, which is kind of wild when you think about the fact that the entire flowering plant kingdom evolved in that same amount of time. So this is a great story. It's a really cool tree. This is it. You're welcome to come up and check him out after my talk. And I love this species because I just think it's the perfect way to illustrate the aspect of our global tree conservation program that's concerned about public awareness and conservation education. Once the botanical garden community discovered this tree, we really mobilized to develop horticultural knowledge and propagation techniques so that we could spread the word and share this plant with people all over the world. In 2005, I was actually working at the Royal Botanic Garden at Kew in London, and Sir David Attenborough, one of my huge heroes, planted this tree in the garden. It was the first time I saw it in real life. And it did really well, and this is it today. It's almost outgrown its protective cage that was put around it to prevent people from stealing it. And the important thing here is that we have been able to develop these propagation techniques to bring this tree to botanic gardens, and that's why we have it sitting right here. We're also at the point now where the public can just buy these seedlings from the garden gift shop at Kew and plant them in your own yard. They won't grow here, sadly, outside, which is why he's still in a pot. But I think this is so important because by being able to disseminate these plants to people, it relieves a lot of the pressure on the wild populations. It means people aren't going traipsing through the woods in Australia to pull these things out of their wild population. So it's really important to understand the horticulture and propagation techniques and to tell the public about it and share it. The Morton Arboretum has had a significant role in developing really valuable and impactful education programs related to tree conservation and the value of tree biodiversity. This is one of our excellent education programs. It is a traveling exhibit with complementary teaching materials that is called Vanishing Acts. And it highlights about a dozen threatened and endangered trees from around the world. And this is our sign for Wollemi pine. The whole exhibit is out on display right now in our dwarf conifer collection. And I recommend that everybody go check it out if you haven't seen it yet. And this is just a fantastic way to sort of spread the word and teach people about the importance of tree biodiversity. It's also a traveling exhibit, so we provide it to other botanic gardens and they can display it and show it to their guests and their visitors. And we've translated it to Chinese, and it's on display in several gardens in China now too. And we produced this program, this project with our conservation partners, who are Botanic Gardens Conservation International, that nonprofit that we mentioned earlier, through their program, the Global Trees Campaign, which is the only international conservation program totally dedicated to protecting the world's threatened tree species. So these two symbols you'll probably see a lot around, what we do with the Global Tree Conservation Program, because they're really our key partners in conservation efforts. Now let's move from Australia to China. And this is the beautiful Magnolia sinica. This is a very large magnolia tree that is native to southern Yunnan province in China, very close to Vietnam. It is a lovely tree, but is unfortunately on the verge of extinction. It is critically endangered because there are fewer than 50 individuals of this tree left in the wild. This is the tallest living individual, and I'll explain the scaffolding in a minute. But it sort of illustrates one of the problems with Magnolia sinica is that all the trees that have been discovered in the wild are adult. And in fact, they're kind of old adults. They're nearing the end of their lives. We've never found a seedling or a sapling growing in the woods right now, which means that at some point in the last sort of 50 or 100 years, these trees stopped natural recruitment in the wild, which is a big problem because you don't have any juveniles to grow up into adults. So this species really does a great job of illustrating our initiative for developing collaborations for tree conservation in China. Why China? That's really far away. Well, China is a mega diverse country. It's one of these biodiversity hotspots, so large patches of China here are considered a biodiversity hotspot. Remember, that's lots of species, but lots of habitat destruction. They have over 30,000 native plant species, which I think is the third biggest record behind like maybe Brazil and Colombia. They have 11,000 woody plants, which includes 3,200 species of tree. So incredibly valuable, rich diversity there. And the Morton Arboretum has a very long history of plant collecting and collections from China. Some of our earliest accessions, some of our earliest trees in our grounds were received directly by our founder, Joy Morton, from China. And when the country opened up again to the West in the early 90s, our vice president of collections, Chris Bachtel, was one of the first botanists in there to work with them and to collect some of the interesting species they have there. This is him perched very precariously up an ash tree in China collecting seed. China and the US have very similar climatic zones. This is sort of a rough estimate of how you might overlay our two countries to match up the climatic regions. And Chicago is actually very close to Beijing in this sense. We also have similar conservation challenges in our increased urbanization, deforestation, and a declining urban forest. So our objectives in China are to develop strategic collaborative projects with certain institutions and researchers over there. We want to promote tree conservation generally, and we want to catalyze and influence the Chinese botanical garden and arboretum network. So how are we doing that? Well, we go there. We go there and we travel around and we tromp all over the country. And we go to universities and botanic gardens and arboreta and plant science research institutes. And we go out into the field. We go to the nature reserves and we see where some of their conservation programs are actually happening on the ground. And one of our key target collaborating institutes there is the Kunming Botanic Garden in Yunnan province. And this is coming back to the Magnolia sinica. The reason we're so excited about working with Kunming Botanic Garden is that the director, Dr. Weibang Sun, who is up on top of that platform in that tree, that Magnolia sinica, has just set in a fantastic example of conservation of plant species with extremely small populations in China. So he's really interested in these critically endangered species. He just got a big grant from the Chinese government to implement his program, and it starts by going out into the wild and talking to local people in areas with these endangered species. And he works with the locals and he pays them to identify and discover the trees in the wild so that we're very sure how many of them we have, and to protect them, prevent them from being cut down. Once he finds them, he builds one of these big observation and research platforms around the tree. It doesn't harm the tree, but it allows him and his scientists, his researchers, to get up there and really investigate the reproductive biology of that species. So for Magnolia sinica, this is that one really tall flowering tree. They were up there and we were visiting about 3 days before the buds opened up. So they were all excited and reared up about getting to see these flowers. And they're gonna investigate things like whether or not there are pollinators visiting the flower. If there's pollen, is the pollen viable? If it produces any seed, is the seed viable? All sorts of these questions to say, at what point is the system breaking down? Why are these trees not recruiting in the wild? He then goes and for those trees that are flowering, he will collect the seeds and bring them back to the Botanic Garden. So he's out in the wild doing work, and then he brings it back on site to his garden, and he germinates the seeds in the nursery in Kunming Botanic Garden. Remember, they're not germinating in the wild, so it's not like he's taking them away from their natural habitat. Something's not working. So when he germinates them in the garden, they grow, and they're pretty healthy. And so we were there and went to visit, first of all, his observation platform on his big Magnolia sinica, and then we went to his restoration site. As part of this grant that he got from the government, he has secured land in a nature reserve, and he has planted out about 200 seedlings of Magnolia sinica, and they've been in the ground for a few years now. And when we were there in March, they were about 6 years old, and he had over 80% survival of these seedlings. So this species would literally be going extinct if it weren't for this project, right? He's now like quadrupled the number of these species that's in the wild. So just a fantastic program. We're really excited about it, and we think it's a wonderful model that other arboreta can adopt. So we're promoting it wherever we can. We publish it in peer-reviewed journal articles to tell people about it, and we support him as best we can, and we hope to collaborate with him on these projects in the future. Another organization we're excited about working with is the Shanghai Chenshan Botanic Garden. When we were there in March, this is Dr. Nicole Cavender, our Vice President of Science and Conservation, who is sitting right over there. When we were there in March, we formally signed an agreement to collaborate on a variety of different projects, including tree conservation, but also urban tree care and children's garden development. They are just starting to develop a children's garden. We have a fabulous children's garden, and they are interested to learn from us how to do it. So that's very exciting, and Nicole and our Vice President of Education Programs will be going over there to help lead a workshop on children's gardens this year. We're also excited about working with Dr. Min Deng, who is one of the researchers at Shanghai Chenshan, and she is one of the world experts on Chinese oak species. These are beautiful ring-cupped oaks, and she was over here working with our systematist, Dr. Andrew Hipp, in our molecular systematics lab for 3 months, I think, last year. And we have had some fantastically fruitful collaborations with this and results from this collaboration. So several peer-reviewed journal articles relating to oak conservation, oak systematics, oak evolution. So we're very pleased with that, and we hope that that collaboration carries on in the future. She'll be back here in October to do some more work with us. So how do we actually develop these relationships in China? What do we do? Well, as I said before, we sometimes sign these formal partnerships. This is Nicole with the director of the Beijing Botanic Garden when we sort of formally agreed to collaborate with them on tree conservation. We also have informal meetings, for example, with the forest ecology group at Peking University. And we also go on field excursions. These are fantastic ways to really get to know the researchers and the people that are involved in conservation on the ground. This was an excellent experience in the Wanglang Nature Reserve in Sichuan province, which is also a giant panda reserve, but we did not see any giant pandas, sadly. So this was a great experience because there were, in this crowd of people that all went traipsing around this nature reserve to see their trees, there were government officials, there were park rangers, there were people from conservation organizations, there were academic researchers, there were graduate students, there were people from Botanic Gardens, all together exchanging ideas and sort of sharing information about threatened trees in China. So this is just a really great way to get a feel for what people are doing and what's happening, and also to see how these different sectors work together or don't work together, which was kind of a surprise to see. But in fact, like, there's not a ton of communication between like different botanic gardens, for example, in China. So we really want to be there to help influence that and drive that in a positive direction. Fieldwork is fun. It is also sometimes treacherous, especially when you're walking over a freezing cold, rushing river on a bridge made out of 4 pieces of bamboo. So, you know, going through this with a bunch of other people can be a great way to bond and get wet. Nicole, didn't you fall in the river? Not there. But yeah, it can be a little hairy. It also gives you a wonderful feel for the level of biodiversity in this country. This is in southern Yunnan province where that Magnolia sinica grows. It's a beautiful subtropical rainforest, and we were there one day, and the next day we were here, which is another nature reserve in the Tibetan Plateau. Yeah, that was April. In northern Sichuan province. We were totally unprepared. They said it could be cold, but like we didn't expect a foot of snow. I think Nicole had gloves on her, socks on her hands for gloves. But it was really very cool. And no matter what, it is always a beautiful scenery. It's a fantastic adventure and a wonderful experience. It's really inspiring. And I can't talk about developing relationships in China without talking about food. This is so important. The culture in China is that trust and friendship is really developed over a very long, very over-catered, delicious dinner. And the food is fantastic. I discovered that I actually quite like deep-fried bugs. That was pretty tasty. I didn't bother with the pig brain soup, kind of for obvious reasons, although I'm sure it's delicious. I was not quite brave enough for that one. But you know, if you're prepared for anything and you are willing to sit around the table and have these conversations, it's just a fantastic way to build these relationships. And it's been a very rewarding experience in China. So let's move closer to home. This is Georgia oak, Quercus georgiana. It is native to Alabama and Georgia. It's a very pretty oak. It's a smaller stature oak. It grows up to maybe 20 feet tall, but it can also be a little sort of shrubby plant like this. It grows on granite outcrops and mountaintops in Georgia, in the Piedmont area. And it has beautiful red fall foliage. So this actually has some horticultural value. But it is endangered because of soil erosion, compaction, and again, the seedlings aren't regenerating naturally in the wild. And this oak, I think, is a perfect species to illustrate how we are making oaks our flagship group for tree conservation at the Morton Arboretum. Why oaks? Well, a lot of reasons. Oaks are keystone species in ecosystems around the world, including around here, like this beautiful oak savanna in, I think, Indiana. We also have the problem of oak-dominated ecosystems being in decline also around the world. Another big problem is that oak seeds, their acorns, can't be seed banked. So seed banks are a great way to protect a threatened species because you can collect a bunch of seed and put it in a bank, which is basically a freezer, and sort of preserve it for posterity. So it's sort of like saved away for long term. But acorns don't survive that treatment. If you freeze an acorn and then you try to plant it, 10 years later, it won't germinate. So it means that if we are going to save the oaks that are threatened by having them in collections, they have to be living collections like ours. Oaks are important because they provide valuable timber, fuel, food, dyes, and also some of the finer things in life. These delicious black truffles grow on the roots of Quercus robur. For those of you that enjoy whiskey or bourbon, you can thank the white oak, Quercus alba, for being the barrels that we age our drinks in. And Quercus subur provides us with the cork that we cork our wine bottles with. So I think we can all agree you can find a reason to love an oak tree. They're also beautiful. The group as a whole has an amazing amount of morphological variation. These are 9 different species of oaks that I saw in the National Collection at the Arboretum in France. And it just goes to show what amazing variation there is across the group. They also have amazing ecological and sort of habitat preference variation. So you can have oaks in a desert in Mexico, you can have them in that subtropical jungle in southern China, and then they're growing out here under a foot of snow. So they're a really interesting, diverse group. So what are we doing with them? Well, we have, first of all, a great oak collection of 80 species, including 5 threatened species, which has been recognized as globally significant and is part of our North American oak collection. We have active research on oaks. This is Dr. Andrew Hipp, our systematist, who works on oak evolution. And this is Bob Fahey, our forest ecologist, who focuses on oak ecosystem recovery. We also have some specific conservation initiatives already underway. So this is the Quercus georgiana that you met a moment ago. What we are interested in doing and what we're already doing is conducting a genetic diversity assessment to see of these populations that are left in the wild, and there's only a couple here in Georgia and Alabama, and in fact, the South Carolina populations are gone. We're pretty sure those have been extirpated already. What we're gonna do is take a look at the wild populations and evaluate how genetically diverse they are, and then compare that to so that's the in situ, at their original site. We'll compare that to the trees that we have growing ex situ, meaning outside of their native range. And that's here. Those are the trees that we have on our site and botanic gardens around the world. We want to know how much of that natural genetic diversity we have captured in our living collections. So that if something terrible like a tornado came through and wiped all of these out, would we really be capturing the essence of what it is to be a Georgia oak in our collections? We're also going to make sure that the oaks are in the red list, that threat evaluation. The last time that the oaks were evaluated for their threat level was in 2007, and the survey included less than half of the world's 425 species or so of oaks. So we are going to make sure that they get onto the red list and gather that information needed to evaluate them. We also want to enhance the conservation value of our oak collection. We do this by confirming the identity of the specimens, basically make sure that they're labeled properly. We're gonna remove undocumented specimens, so the trees where we don't know where they came from. And we're going to increase the number of threatened oak species and the genetic diversity of our collection by bringing in new individuals from the wild. We also want to strengthen the global network of oak experts. So to do that, we'll be hosting the International Oak Society Triennial Conference in October, which will bring together over 100 oak specialists and experts from around the world to talk about oak ecology and evolution and conservation. And I'm super excited. It's going to be a big oak love fest. I can't wait. And we want to finally promote oak conservation to our visitors. It's so important that people like you know what we're up to and what we're worried about. We're going to do this by increasing the interpretation, the signage in our oak collection and in our tram tour. We provide wonderful oak classes and summer camps for kids to learn about oaks. We have oak-focused special events coming up, like whiskey tastings and wine tastings, so I encourage all of you to come to those. And ultimately, we want to inspire the next generation of oak enthusiasts, because it's so important that this carries on through the generations to make sure that we have happy, healthy oaks for the future. So in summary, trees all over the world are threatened with extinction. The global tree biodiversity crisis requires a global solution. So the Morton Arboretum is taking a leadership role in global tree conservation through strategic initiatives in the Global Tree Conservation Program. The ones I talked about today are our public outreach and education programs, our collaborations in China, and oaks being our flagship group. And I just want to say that none of this would be possible without the support of our members and visitors like you who come to hear our talks and support us and walk around our gardens and appreciate what we do. So thank you.